Brian, let me go to you because, if you look at some of the polling data, a very tiny percentage of people say if Trump is convicted, and he has now been convicted, 34 counts, that it's not going to change their minds. And in fact, a substantial number are saying if he's convicted, it's going to make me want to vote for him even more. So if this was, as Leo said, all political by design to damage Trump, to delegitimize his candidacy, to interfere in the upcoming election, I think it may have backfired. What do you think?
Greg, I 100% agree with you. I mean, this is staggering. And there's no question that people across the country are going to look at this. They call this a jury trial. It was really a three-ring circus put on by the Democratic Party. And I think what it's going to do is clearly backfire. People are going to look at what happened over the last 5 or 6 weeks, Greg, and they're going to come to the conclusion that this is exactly what we don't want in our country. And that's why we need President Trump, former President Trump, as the next president, because we need a president that's going to honor the Constitution, that's going to honor due process rights, that's going to stop court systems across the country from using the justice system as a political missile to try to get to their agenda. And that's what happened here. And I think this whole 5-6 weeks is everything that this country doesn't want to see. And I think that's going to tilt voters clearly in Trump's camp. And Greg, I wanted to share this with you. I mean, this beyond a reasonable doubt burden of proof was proven by the following: an inference, right? An inference. There was a jury instruction talking about you can prove a fact through an inference, right? Remember that rain inference we got in law school? Hey, if you go to bed at night and it's clear and you wake up in the morning, that means it rained, right? Are you kidding me? You're going to get a felony conviction with guilt by association. That's really what happened here. There was not one single piece of evidence that Trump knew anything about falsifying financials. And what about what Andrew and Leo are talking about? Intent to defraud? We didn't hear anything about an intent to defraud anybody. This was all done through an inference. And that is unprecedented and staggering in our U.S. justice system.
I want to talk to you, Brian, about potential sentencing for 34 counts. Now, I'm of the opinion that, Trump's a first-time offender. It's a nonviolent crime. He was, after all, president of the United States. He's the leading contender for the presidency now. And this judge has to recognize that this was one crime, not 34. It was simply multiplied in count stacking maneuver. And I've got to think that jail time is not on the table. What do you think?
Hey, Greg, I think it was wrong for the judge to even allow this to be characterized as 34 counts, right? Let's go through each one. Guilty on 1, 2, and then counting all the way up to 34, right? Isn't that a little bit unusual? Is that really necessary for a bookkeeping fraud case? This was really one set of facts that involved some other vouchers and checks that were written. This is one crime. That's my opinion. And I'm with you on this. You've got a decorated former president, no prior criminal record. Like you said, it's not a violent crime. And like this judge will never admit this crime. I'll bet if you went on the records, Greg, back 50 years, you probably can't ever find a conviction for this because it's probably never been prosecuted before. So I think that this should not be jail time. And I think the judge should also take into consideration the presidential election. I mean, Trump's got to appeal. I think you, Leo, Andrew, everybody's raising a great point that this now involves federal due process issues, right? I mean, I wouldn't even, Trump's got to go through the channels, right? But eventually, worst case scenario, somewhere down the road, I'd file a writ of habeas corpus with the U.S. Supreme Court because this is a U.S. constitutional violation. So before you even get to sentencing, I mean, Trump's got to file his appeals, go through that process. But look, at the end of the day, it might hurt President Trump because of all the comments that he made every day about this judge. He just did it now. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have done that, but I'm just saying, how's this judge going to separate personal animus toward former President Trump from carrying out justice, because he's already set a precedent for the last 5 weeks that he doesn't care about that.
But the moment guilty was read on the first count, since the other ones were simply redundant, it was guilty on all 34 counts. You know, I'm skeptical. First of all, I do think that Brian makes a great point. In addition to a common law writ, I'd also go with a writ of habeas corpus, and we've talked about it here. There are so many due process violations. Those are constitutional under the federal Constitution. And for example, in the most recent case, just 4 years ago, the Supreme Court said, you states, including New York, are bound by the federal Constitution. You have to abide by it. This judge didn't in so many different ways. And so I do think that going the federal route is really the only smart way. But the question remains, in an election year, does this Supreme Court, which is already under siege for taking the immunity case, the obstruction case, both of which involve Donald Trump, are they really going to take yet another political hot potato? Brian, you first.
Oh, I think here, absolutely. I mean, this is a precedent-setting case. I mean, a rational, objective court looking at this needs to set the record straight. Leo can attest this. He's a great trial lawyer. This, again, Greg, for us trial lawyers that have been in the courtroom for all these years, this is not how trials are conducted. And getting to your point again, let's set other grounds for the appeal too. I'd file a motion to set aside this verdict in the next couple of days based on no evidence supporting the verdict, right? That's another grounds that you can then perfect the record, Greg, and use that as another appellate tool down the road. And to your point, I had a case years ago in West Palm Beach, Florida, involving Dalia Dippolito. I did 2 jury trials for her, got a hung jury on the first one, guilty on the second. And guess what? The appellate lawyer that's helping us on this case just filed a couple of months ago a federal writ of habeas corpus. We're going all the way up to the Supreme Court based on a similar argument. That was a state court case I had, but we're now in federal court because constitutional rights were violated, due process rights were violated in a state court. So that's something positive we can take from this. That you can't go hide in some politically driven Democratic courtroom, break all the rules, and say that's now the new law in the country. Luckily, we have a constitution. Luckily, we have federal courts that are going to look at this, and it's laughable. They're going to toss this thing out in a heartbeat. Hey, Greg.
Brian, we predicted that the goal all along was for Biden to be able to call Trump a convicted felon. So he didn't waste any time. Literally, minutes later, he issues a statement calling Trump a convicted felon.
Yeah. Yeah, Greg, exactly. And to Leo's point, this never was a jury trial to seek justice. It was never that. What this was a last resort for the Democratic Party. What do I mean by that? This was their life jacket. They were throwing a life jacket out to President Biden to try to save this election. That's what this trial was about. And that's why President Biden's making these comments right now. One comment I want to make about his statement about our freedoms being ripped away by former President Trump. Are you kidding me? We just saw our freedoms ripped away for the last 6 weeks by a highly conflicted judge who Greg put on the record. This is how astonishing Merchant was. He put on the record a couple weeks ago, hey, yeah, I think we went a little bit too far with that Stormy Daniels testimony. Do you remember that, Greg? This is a trial judge admitting on the record that he knew in his heart that he was letting in evidence that was highly inflammatory, that would lead to a conviction. And guess what? If I'm repping Trump on appeal, I'm pulling out that transcript where Merchant admits it on the record, and use that when you get up to the federal courts for an appeal.
And Brian, your final thoughts. I think Ron makes a great point. Alvin Bragg won today. but that doesn't mean he's going to win in the end, does it?
No, Greg, this is a heavyweight fight, right? Last time I checked, there's 12 rounds in a heavyweight battle, right? And here we've got former President Trump that was knocked down to the mat by this feigned jury verdict. But what did he do? He did what our country wants to see. And you mentioned a half hour ago, he got up off the mat after this travesty of justice. And what did he do? He walked out of the courtroom and waved to people. What people want in our country, Greg, is a warrior. That's why the boxing analogy is great. You ever watched a fight where a fighter gets knocked down, tries to get back up and goes back down on his knee? We don't want somebody like that. We want somebody like former President Trump who got knocked down, and it's maybe the 8th round or 9th round of the fight, but he got back up. And he's a warrior. And people across this country want a warrior in their corner going to battle for the next 4 years. And my final thoughts are, we've got at least 3 or 4 more rounds of this heavyweight match to go. And there are a lot of appellate issues that have to be brought up both in the state level and then, as Ron mentioned, also eventually into the federal level habeas corpus with the U.S. District Court judge, and then all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think by the time we get to the 12th round, and then we've got those judges ruling on this boxing match, we're going to find that the U.S. Supreme Court judges are going to rule eventually in favor of former President Trump. Because Greg, don't let Alvin Bragg fool you or the public. When he says the jury followed the evidence and the law, no. What they followed was fruit of the poisonous tree. When you have bad evidence that gets in front of a jury, then they'll do something like this. This was not pure, legitimate evidence, and it was bad law, and that's what led to ultimately a bad verdict.
I want to thank Brian Claypool, Ron Chapman, belatedly Andrew Stoltman, who joined us earlier. Of course, my colleagues, Sean Hannity and Jason Chaffetz and Pete Hegseth and, the whole crew for joining this Fox Nation special. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us.